What happens when wealth meets worth? When privilege confronts perseverance? Some say fate has a way of bringing together souls that need each other most, even when they appear to be worlds apart. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Hit that like button, share with someone who needs to hear this story, and save it to watch again later. Your support helps us continue creating content that touches hearts and changes lives. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Westbrook Farmers Market, an institution that had stood in the small New England town for over 2 centuries. Among the wooden stalls and canvas canopies, vendors were already setting up their displays, the air filled with the mingling scents of fresh produce, baked goods, and the earthy aroma of flowers and herbs. This market was more than a place of commerce. It was the beating heart of the community, where stories, recipes, and traditions passed from generation to generation. Charlotte Miller arrived as the sun began burning through the fog, her ancient pickup truck rattling to a stop at the back entrance. At 32, her face carried the gentle weathering of someone who spent their days outdoors. Faint lines etched around eyes that remained bright, despite the hardships she'd endured. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands, though slender, bore the calluses of hard work. "Emma, grab that basket of lavender, please. Jack, be careful with those glass bottles," she instructed her children as they hopped out of the truck. 8-year-old Emma, with her mother's earnest eyes and determined chin, took the basket with the ceremonious care of someone entrusted with a treasure. 6-year-old Jack, all boundless energy despite the early hour, made exaggerated careful movements with the box of homemade tinctures and remedies. "Mom, Mrs. Peterson said her arthritis is much better after using our joint salve," Emma said, pride evident in her voice. Charlotte smiled as she unloaded the rest of their goods. "That's wonderful, sweetie. That's why we do this work, to help people." Their stall, Miller's Herbal Remedies, was modest compared to others in the market. No flashy displays or expensive fixtures, just clean wooden tables, carefully labeled products, and an assortment of potted herbs. Charlotte had taken pains to make it inviting, hanging dried flower garlands and herbs from the beams, arranging her remedies by ailment, adding handwritten descriptions explaining each item's properties and uses. While Jack arranged smooth river stones around the potted plants, his special contribution to the display, Charlotte noticed a cluster of vendors gathered near the market entrance, their faces tight with worry. "What's happening?" she asked Sarah, the baker whose stall neighbored hers. Sarah glanced around before leaning in. "They say he's coming today, the Duke." Charlotte's hands stilled on the jar she was positioning. "Alexander Montgomery? Here? Why?" It wasn't truly a ducal title, of course. America had no formal aristocracy. But generations ago, when the first Montgomery had purchased vast tracts of land in this corner of New England, the local people had nicknamed him the Duke for his lordly ways and English heritage. The name had stuck, passed down through the Montgomery line along with their fortune and considerable local influence. "Market evaluations, they're saying," Sarah whispered. "Word is he wants to modernize the property. You know what that means." Charlotte knew all too well. Modernization was rarely kind to small vendors like herself. The current marketplace operated on a structure established decades ago, with reasonable rents and a focus on local producers. Modernization inevitably meant higher fees, corporate vendors, and the slow extinction of family businesses like hers. She tried to push her worries aside as the first customers began trickling in. Morning regulars stopped by for their usual purchases, Mrs. Finch for her headache tincture, Mr. Gonzalez for the special tea blend that helped his digestion, and Miss Winters, a young teacher who swore by Charlotte's sleep sachets. As the morning progressed, Charlotte almost forgot about the looming threat. She loved these interactions, explaining how echinacea could boost immunity, demonstrating how to steep the perfect cup of chamomile tea, or showing a young mother how to use diluted lavender oil for a colicky baby. This wasn't just her livelihood, it was her calling. The knowledge passed down from her grandmother, who had learned from her grandmother before her. Emma and Jack were fixtures at the market too. Unlike many children their age, they didn't complain about spending weekends working. Emma had already developed an impressive knowledge of the herbs, eagerly sharing information with customers. Jack, though less focused on the products themselves, charmed everyone with his earnest offering of magic stones he collected from the creek behind their cottage. For good luck, he'd declare solemnly as he pressed them into customers' hands. Around noon, a change swept through the market. Conversations hushed, postures straightened, and eyes darted toward the main entrance. Charlotte didn't need to look to know what was happening, but she looked anyway. Alexander Montgomery Thior had arrived. He moved through the market like a man accustomed to parting crowds. Tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that stood in stark contrast to the casual attire of market-goers, he emanated authority without effort. His features might have been called handsome if they weren't set in such a detached expression. Strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes the color of a winter sky. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the market's breeze. Flanking him were two assistants, one clutching a tablet, the other speaking in hushed tones into a phone. Behind them trailed the market manager, Harold Peters, whose usual confident demeanor had been replaced by anxious obsequiousness. As you can see, Mr. Montgomery, we've maintained the historical character of the market while making necessary updates to plumbing and electrical systems, Harold was saying, gesturing at the exposed beams overhead. Attendance has been consistent, though of course we always see room for growth. Alexander Montgomery barely acknowledged the explanation, his gaze methodically scanning each stall they passed. Occasionally he would nod at the tablet-wielding assistant, who would tap something into her device. Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. There was something unsettling about seeing the market, this warm, living, breathing space, being assessed like entries on a spreadsheet. She'd heard stories about Alexander Montgomery from other vendors, how he had taken over his family, his vast business empire after his father's death 5 years ago, how he had swiftly divested from underperforming assets, and doubled the family fortune through strategic acquisitions and developments, how he rarely visited the properties his family owned, preferring to manage them remotely from his Manhattan office or the Montgomery estate that overlooked the town from its hillside perch. "Mom," Emma whispered, tugging at Charlotte's sleeve, "why is everyone acting strange?" Before Charlotte could respond, Jack's voice piped up with the uninhibited volume of a 6-year-old. "Is that man a real duke? Does he have a castle? Does he fight dragons?" Several nearby customers chuckled, breaking the tension momentarily. Charlotte hushed him gently. "No dragons, honey. And no, he's not a real duke. That's just what people call him." But Jack's questions had drawn the attention of the Montgomery entourage. Alexander's gaze shifted to their small stall, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the modest display. Charlotte straightened her spine and met his look directly, refusing to show the intimidation she felt. For a moment, their eyes locked. Hers warm brown, his cool blue, a silent clash of worlds. Then, with a slight furrow of his brow, Alexander Montgomery turned to his assistant and murmured something. The woman consulted her tablet, nodded and made another notation. Charlotte watched as they continued their procession through the market, a knot forming in her stomach. She had a bad feeling about this visit. The last 3 months had been difficult financially. David's military pension only stretched so far, and after the unexpected repairs to their cottage roof, she'd fallen behind on her market fees. Harold had been understanding, allowing her to make partial payments when she could, but she knew that such unofficial arrangements wouldn't matter to a man like Alexander Montgomery. As if reading her thoughts, Harold broke away from the group and hurried over to her stall. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low and urgent, "he's asking about vendors who are behind on payments. I tried to explain about your situation, but..." He trailed off, his expression apologetic. "It's fine, Harold," she said, though they both knew it wasn't. "I'll figure something out." After Harold hurried back to the Montgomery entourage, Charlotte turned to find both her children watching her with solemn expressions. "Is something wrong, Mom?" Emma asked, too perceptive for her age. Charlotte forced a smile. "Nothing we can't handle, sweetheart. We're millers, remember? And what do millers do?" "We bend with the wind, but never break," the children recited together, echoing the family motto that had carried Charlotte through her husband's deployment, his death, and the years of rebuilding a life for herself and her children. As she watched Alexander Montgomery disappear into the market office with Harold, Charlotte wondered if those words would hold true against the coming storm. Little did she know that this day would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything both she and the so-called Duke believed about themselves and each other. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the hills, mirroring the uncertainty that now hung over Westbrook Farmers Market and the people who called it home. If you're enjoying this heartfelt journey, make sure to subscribe for the full story. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances, share with someone who appreciates tales of transformation, and save this video to your favorites to return to whenever you need inspiration. 3 days had passed since Alexander Montgomery's initial visit to the market. 3 days during which Charlotte had alternated between hope and dread. Perhaps the inspection had been routine. Perhaps nothing would change. Perhaps the so-called Duke would return to his Manhattan offices and forget about the small-town market that contributed so little to his vast fortune. Those hopes evaporated on the fourth morning. Charlotte had just finished arranging a new display of autumn wellness blends when a sleek black Bentley glided to a stop at the market's entrance. The vehicle alone was worth more than most vendors earned in 5 years. As if on cue, conversations throughout the market dimmed, replaced by the hushed murmurs that seemed to accompany Alexander Montgomery wherever he went. This time, he wasn't conducting a general inspection. He moved with purpose, his gaze fixed forward, the sharp lines of his bespoke suit cutting through the market's casual atmosphere like a blade. Behind him trailed the same 2 assistants, their expressions professionally neutral as they navigated the narrow pathways between stalls. "He's coming this way," Sarah whispered, abandoning her bread display to edge closer to Charlotte. "And he doesn't look like he's here to buy herbal tea." Charlotte's fingers instinctively tightened around the mason jar she was holding. Emma, who had been arranging dried flower sachets, pressed against her mother's side. Even Jack, usually oblivious to adult tensions, stopped arranging his stones and looked up with wide eyes. "Mrs. Miller." Alexander's voice was deep and refined, carrying the polish of expensive education. He didn't offer a hand to shake, merely inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than a greeting. "I believe we haven't been formally introduced. Alexander Montgomery." "Charlotte Miller," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "These are my children, Emma and Jack." His eyes flickered briefly to the children before returning to Charlotte. There was something in that fleeting glance, not warmth exactly, but perhaps recognition, that disappeared so quickly she might have imagined it. "Mrs. Miller, I've been reviewing the market's financial records," he continued without preamble. "It appears you've fallen significantly behind on your vendor fees, 3 months to be precise." The directness of his approach, here in front of her children and neighboring vendors, made her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. She was aware of Sarah hovering nearby, pretending to rearrange pastries but clearly listening. Other vendors too had slowed their activities, eyes darting toward the confrontation. "I've been making partial payments when I can," Charlotte explained, keeping her voice low. "Harold Mr. Peters has been understanding about my situation." Alexander's expression didn't change. "Yes, I've spoken with Mr. Peters about his flexible payment arrangements. While I appreciate the challenges small business owners face, the market operates on established regulations. Exceptions create precedents." One of his assistants stepped forward, extending a crisp white envelope. "This contains formal notice. You have 1 week to settle your outstanding balance of $1,250, or you'll need to vacate your space." Charlotte's stomach dropped. 1 week. 1 week to produce a sum that might as well have been $1 million given her current finances. The medical bills from David's final illness had depleted their savings, and what little remained had gone to fixing the cottage roof last month after heavy storms. "A week isn't enough time," she said, fighting to keep her voice from trembling. "The terms are quite generous considering the length of the delinquency," Alexander replied, his tone suggesting this was already a concession. "The market has expenses, Mrs. Miller. Maintenance, security, utilities, costs that vendor fees are meant to cover. When some don't pay, others effectively subsidize them." His words were reasonable, logical even, but delivered with a coldness that suggested he viewed this as nothing more than a business transaction, another line item to be resolved on his family's vast ledger of assets. Emma, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. But people need Mum's medicines. Mrs. Peterson's arthritis, Mr. Gonzalez's stomach problems. Mum helps them when regular medicine doesn't work. Alexander's gaze shifted to the child, a flicker of surprise crossing his features at her articulate defense. "Emma?" Charlotte murmured, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. But Emma wasn't finished. "Dad always said that helping people was more important than money. That's what he fought for." At the mention of her late husband, Charlotte felt a familiar ache in her chest. David had indeed lived by that principle, choosing to serve his country rather than pursue more lucrative careers that had been open to him with his engineering degree. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, so subtle that Charlotte nearly missed it. A momentary softening around the eyes, quickly replaced by his usual detached demeanor. "I understand there are human elements to business decisions," he conceded, his tone marginally less frigid. "However, the market functions on economic principles. Sentiment doesn't maintain the infrastructure." His assistant cleared her throat delicately. "Mr. Montgomery, you have a call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. Alexander checked his watch, a timepiece that could likely cover Charlotte's debt several times over, and nodded. "1 week, Mrs. Miller. I suggest you use it productively." As he turned to leave, Jack darted forward, holding out one of his river stones, a smooth grey specimen with a ribbon of white quartz running through it. "This is a lucky stone," he announced, offering it up to Alexander with complete sincerity. "It might help you not be sad anymore." Alexander froze, staring down at the small boy and his outstretched hand, as if Jack had presented him with something entirely foreign. For a heartbeat, the carefully constructed facade of Alexander Montgomery, businessman, heir, duke, seemed to waver. "Jack," Charlotte began, mortified, but Alexander, after a moment's hesitation, accepted the stone. He didn't smile, but something in his posture changed, a nearly imperceptible relaxation of his shoulders. "Thank you," he said simply, tucking the stone into his pocket, with a formality that suggested he was completing a business transaction rather than accepting a child's gift. With a final nod, he continued his departure, assistants trailing in his wake. The market seemed to exhale collectively as he disappeared through the main entrance, the tension that had accompanied his presence gradually dissipating. Sarah rushed over immediately. "Charlotte, I can't believe he did that, confronting you in front of everyone. What are you going to do?" Charlotte stared at the white envelope in her hands, feeling its weight far beyond the single sheet of paper it contained. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I just don't know." Throughout the rest of the day, other vendors stopped by her stall, offering sympathetic words and worried glances. The market community was tight-knit. They looked after their own. But Charlotte knew that goodwill couldn't generate $1,250 in a week. By closing time, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. As she and the children packed up their unsold inventory, the reality of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. Without her market stall, she would lose not just income, but her connection to the community, her purpose, her family legacy. "Mom?" Emma's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are we going to lose our spot?" Charlotte looked at her daughter's worried face and pulled her into a hug. "I'm going to figure something out, sweetie, I promise." But as they drove home in their aging pickup truck, Charlotte couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror at the market growing smaller behind them, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. Alexander Montgomery's Bentley climbed the winding road to Oak Ridge Estate, the family property that had overlooked Westbrook since 1875. The landscaped grounds and stately mansion were a far cry from the homey bustle of the farmer's market, a physical manifestation of the social distance between himself and vendors like Charlotte Miller. "The Tokyo call has been pushed to 8 p.m., his assistant informed him. "And Ms. Wellington called twice. She'd like to know when you'll be returning to Manhattan." Alexander nodded absently, his mind still at the market. He had prepared for resistance when delivering eviction notices. Anger, pleas, perhaps even tears. What he hadn't anticipated was the quiet dignity of Charlotte Miller, or the straightforward wisdom of her children. There had been something disarming about their sincerity, something that had momentarily pierced the armor he'd spent years perfecting. Inside his study, He dismissed his staff and sat alone at his desk, reflexively reaching into his pocket. His fingers closed around the smooth stone Jack Miller had given him. A lucky stone. To help him not be sad anymore. The child's perception was unnerving. Alexander had built his public persona carefully, efficient, decisive, uncompromising. Nothing in his demeanor should have suggested sadness to a 6-year-old boy. He placed the stone on his desk and opened his laptop, intent on returning to the modernization plans for the market property. The projections were promising. By converting the space into an upscale retail and dining destination, they could triple the property's revenue within 2 years. The farmer's market, while charming, was financially inefficient. Sentimentality was a luxury he couldn't afford as the steward of the Montgomery legacy. And yet, his fingers hovered over the keyboard, his usual focus elusive. Instead of revenue projections, he saw Charlotte Miller's determined face as she stood her ground. Instead of construction timelines, he saw Emma's earnest defense of her mother's work. Instead of profit margins, he saw Jack's innocent offering of a lucky stone. The chirp of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Vanessa Wellington's name flashed on the screen. His fiancée of 8 months, the culmination of what his mother called an advantageous match. Vanessa's family owned the 3rd largest investment firm on the East Coast. Their engagement had been celebrated in the society pages as the merger of legacy powers. Alexander, Vanessa's voice was crisp and cultured. I expected you back in Manhattan by now. The Harrington's gala is tomorrow evening. Something came up with the Westbrook property, he replied, shifting back into the role she expected of him. I'll return tomorrow afternoon. Is it really necessary for you to handle these matters personally? That's what property managers are for. Some things require a direct approach. There was a pause before Vanessa continued. Well, don't forget, we have the meeting with the wedding planner on Sunday. The plaza needs our final decisions on the arrangements. Their wedding was 6 months away, a carefully orchestrated event designed to cement their family's alliance. Alexander had approached it with the same methodical attention he gave to business acquisitions, identifying objectives, analyzing benefits, executing efficiently. I'll be there, he assured her. After ending the call, his gaze returned to Jack's stone on the desk. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he picked it up again, turning it over in his palm. The market situation should have been straightforward. Enforce the rules, remove delinquent vendors, proceed with modernization. Clean, simple, profitable. So why did the image of Charlotte Miller and her children linger in his mind like an equation he couldn't balance? Alexander set the stone aside and returned to his computer, determined to focus. The Montgomery name was built on decisive action, not wavering sentiment. Tomorrow he would review the other vendor situations, and in a week, Charlotte Miller would either pay her debt or vacate her stall. That was business. Nothing personal about it. And yet, as night fell over Oak Ridge Estate, Alexander found himself standing at the window, looking down at the town lights below, the small stone somehow back in his hand, his thoughts repeatedly returning to the market and the family whose future he now held in his grasp. If this story has captured your heart, don't forget to subscribe to follow Charlotte and Alexander's journey. Like this video to support stories of courage and transformation, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and save it to your favorites to revisit this touching tale. The following day dawned grey and misty, perfectly matching Charlotte's mood as she navigated the winding roads to the market. She had spent most of the night reviewing her finances, searching for some solution to her impending eviction. Her herbs and tinctures brought in steady business, but never enough for substantial savings, not with Emma's asthma medication and the ongoing repairs to their aging cottage. "Mom, are you okay?" Emma asked from the passenger seat, her perceptive eyes studying Charlotte's face. "You didn't eat breakfast." Charlotte managed to smile. "Just thinking, sweetie." "Big thoughts." "About the Duke?" Jack piped up from the back seat. "Mr. Montgomery," Charlotte corrected gently. "And yes, partly about him." "I don't think he's really mean," Jack said, with the strange intuition children sometimes possess. "He looked sad when he took my lucky stone." Charlotte had replayed that moment several times in her mind. the flicker of something almost human that had crossed Alexander Montgomery's face when Jack offered him the Riverstone. It had been so brief, so quickly masked by his usual detachment, that she wondered if she'd imagined it. "Well, sad or not, he still wants us to pay money we don't have," Emma said pragmatically, sounding far older than her 8 years. Charlotte reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand. Emma had always been the practical one, processing the world with clear-eyed assessment even as a toddler. David used to joke that she'd been born 40 years old, with an old soul in a tiny body. "We'll figure it out," Charlotte promised, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. The market was already bustling when they arrived, Saturday being the busiest day of the week. As they set up their stall, several vendors stopped by with small gestures of solidarity. Sarah bringing over fresh muffins, old Mr. Chen from the tea stall offering words of encouragement, the Ramirez family from the vegetable stand insisting Charlotte take home a bag of produce at day's end. "We look after our own here," Mrs. Ramirez said firmly. "That man may own the land, but he doesn't own us." The support warmed Charlotte's heart, even as she recognized its limits. Community solidarity wouldn't pay her vendor fees, and good intentions wouldn't stop Alexander Montgomery from executing his plans for the market. The morning passed in a blur of customers and sales. Despite her worries, Charlotte found comfort in the familiar rhythm, measuring dried herbs into paper bags, explaining the benefits of different tinctures, recommending teas for specific ailments. This was her heritage, knowledge passed down through generations of Miller women. The thought that next week she might lose this connection to her past, this service to her community, created an ache deep in her chest. Shortly before noon, a ripple of tension passed through the market. Charlotte didn't need to look up to know its cause. The sudden hush followed by urgent whispers told her everything. Alexander Montgomery had returned. This time, however, he wasn't accompanied by assistants. He moved through the market alone, his tailored charcoal overcoat and silver scarf marking him as distinctly different from the weekend shoppers in their casual attire. His purposeful stride brought him directly to Charlotte's stall. "Mrs. Miller," he said by way of greeting, his breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. "Mr. Montgomery," she replied, acutely aware of Emma and Jack watching wide-eyed from behind her and neighboring vendors pretending not to observe the interaction. "I wonder if I might have a word, in private." The request or command, given his tone, surprised her. Charlotte hesitated, glancing at her children. "Sarah," she called softly to her friend at the neighboring stall, "would you mind keeping an eye on Emma and Jack for a few minutes?" Sarah nodded, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity as she beckoned the children over. "Come help me arrange these cinnamon rolls, you two." Charlotte followed Alexander to a quiet corner near the market's stone wall, where ancient ivy climbed between weathered bricks. The area was partially sheltered by the overhanging roof, creating a pocket of relative privacy amidst the market's bustle. "I've been reviewing your situation," Alexander began without preamble, his voice businesslike. "Our records show you've been a vendor here for nearly 6 years. 7, Charlotte corrected. "I started helping my grandmother here when I was pregnant with Emma, then took over the stall when she passed." Something flashed across Alexander's face, irritation at being corrected perhaps, or something else she couldn't quite identify. 7 years, he amended, "and your payment history was impeccable until 3 months ago. May I ask what changed?" The question, while professionally posed, felt invasive. Charlotte wrestled with how much to reveal. This man held her livelihood in his hands, but he was not a friend or confidant. "My husband was a veteran," she finally said, choosing her words carefully. "He passed away 2 years ago. There were medical expenses at the end that insurance didn't cover. We've been managing, but when the cottage roof needed emergency repairs after the September storms," she stopped herself, realizing she was providing more justification than he'd asked for. "I fell behind," she finished simply. Alexander's expression remained neutral, but his gaze became more assessing. "Your husband served in the military?" "Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan. He came home with injuries that eventually—" She trailed off, unwilling to detail David's slow decline to this stranger. "Yes, he served." Alexander nodded slowly, My grandfather was military as well, naval officer during Korea. The personal disclosure, however small, surprised Charlotte. It seemed out of character for the detached businessman she'd encountered thus far. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, deciding to address the immediate issue, "I understand your position regarding the vendor fees. I'm not asking for charity, but 1 week isn't enough time for me to raise that kind of money. If I could have an extension, perhaps a payment plan." "The market's regulations are clear," he interrupted, his tone cooling again. "Vendors must remain current on fees or forfeit their spaces. Making exceptions creates precedents." "Yes, you mentioned that." Charlotte felt a flicker of frustration break through her careful composure. But rules without compassion become tools of oppression rather than order. The words, her husband's words actually, slipped out before she could reconsider them. David had often said this during discussions about his military experiences, about the difference between leadership and mere authority. Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly, genuine surprise registering on his face. Clearly, he wasn't accustomed to being challenged so directly, especially by someone in Charlotte's position. An interesting perspective, Mrs. Miller, but hardly applicable to basic business practices. The market isn't a charity or a social service. It's a commercial enterprise. Is that all it is? Charlotte felt something ignite within her. Not anger exactly, but a fierce protectiveness for what the market represented. "Have you actually spent any time here, Mr. Montgomery? Have you seen how this place brings the community together? How it provides fresh food to people who might otherwise not have access? How it gives small producers a chance to survive in a world increasingly dominated by corporations?" She took a step closer, her voice lowering with intensity rather than rising. "This market has existed for generations. Your family may own the property, but this place belongs to the community. It's not just about vendor fees and profit margins." Alexander's expression tightened, the brief glimpse of humanity vanishing behind his professional mask. "Sentiment doesn't maintain infrastructure, Mrs. Miller, nor does it pay property taxes or insurance premiums. The market exists because it's economically viable to maintain it. If that changes, if profit is your only measure of value, then you're missing the point entirely," Charlotte interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Some things matter precisely because they can't be measured in dollars." A tense silence fell between them. Charlotte could hear her heart pounding in her ears, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had never been confrontational by nature, but something about Alexander Montgomery's cold assessment of the market, her community, had broken through her usual reserve. For a moment, something like respect flickered in Alexander's eyes. Whatever response he might have made, however, was interrupted by a commotion from nearby. "I told you to be careful with those," a woman's sharp voice carried across the market space. Charlotte turned to see a striking blonde woman in an expensive camel coat and high-heeled boots, berating one of the teenage helpers who had apparently bumped into her. The young boy was apologizing profusely, trying to wipe moisture from the woman's sleeve where a small amount of coffee had splashed. "Don't touch me," the woman snapped, pulling away as if the boy were contaminated. "This is cashmere. Do you even know what that means? Of course you don't." Alexander sighed, a small sound that nevertheless communicated volumes. "Excuse me, Mrs. Miller. It seems my fiancé has decided to pay an unexpected visit." Fiancé. The word shouldn't have affected Charlotte at all. This man was practically a stranger, and an antagonistic one at that. Yet something shifted in her perception of him. The blonde woman spotted Alexander, and her demeanor changed instantly, a brilliant smile replacing her previous disdain. "Darling, there you are. I thought I'd surprise you." She approached them with elegant confidence, her salon-perfect hair and flawless makeup creating a stark contrast to Charlotte's practical ponytail and minimal cosmetics. Every aspect of her appearance screamed wealth and privilege, from her designer handbag to the enormous diamond sparkling on her left hand. "Vanessa," Alexander greeted her, his tone neutral. "I wasn't expecting you until this evening." "Clearly," she replied, her gaze sliding dismissively over Charlotte before returning to Alexander. "The call with the wedding planner was moved up, so I thought I'd come early and see this project you've been so occupied with." She glanced around the market with barely concealed distaste. Charlotte Miller, this is Vanessa Wellington, my fiancée, Alexander said, performing the introduction with mechanical courtesy. Vanessa, Mrs. Miller is one of the vendors here. How charming, Vanessa said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. She extended a gloved hand toward Charlotte, the gesture somehow managing to be both proper and condescending. Charlotte accepted the handshake briefly. Nice to meet you, Ms. Wellington. Mrs. Miller sells herbal remedies, Alexander explained, his voice taking on the slightly detached quality it had held during his inspection of the market. Vanessa's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. How folksy. Though I can't imagine there's much market for that sort of thing these days. Not with actual pharmacies available? Before Charlotte could respond, a small voice piped up from behind her. Mom's medicines help lots of people, Emma said, having apparently escaped Sarah's supervision to find her mother. She stood with her shoulders squared, her young face serious as she looked up at Vanessa. Sometimes better than regular medicine. Vanessa's smile tightened. Well, isn't that sweet? Your daughter, I presume. Yes, Charlotte said, placing a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. This is Emma, and I have scientific evidence too, Emma continued earnestly. Mrs. Peterson tried 3 different medicines from the doctor for her arthritis, but only Mom's juniper and turmeric salve helped. That's empirical proof. Alexander made a sound that might almost have been a suppressed laugh, quickly disguised as a cough. Vanessa's smile became brittle. How precocious. We were just concluding our business discussion, Alexander said smoothly. Mrs. Miller, we'll continue this conversation another time. Charlotte recognized the dismissal and nodded. Of course. Emma, let's get back to our stall. As she guided Emma away, she heard Vanessa's voice, pitched low but not quite low enough. Really, Alexander, is this what's been keeping you here? Conversations with local herb witches about vendor fees. Charlotte didn't hear Alexander's response, and she deliberately quickened her pace to avoid hearing more. She had bigger concerns than the opinions of a woman like Vanessa Wellington. Back at her stall, Jack greeted her with excitement. Mom, I sold 3 lucky stones while you were gone. People gave me money. Charlotte's momentary confusion cleared when Sarah leaned over from her bakery stall. The boy's got entrepreneurial spirit, she explained with a grin. He set up a little display of his river stones next to the remedies, called them wellness stones, and told customers they had special properties for happiness and health. $3, Jack announced proudly, holding up his small collection of coins. I'm helping pay the Duke man. The innocence of his gesture, this small child trying to solve an insurmountable adult problem with his Riverstone sales, brought a lump to Charlotte's throat. She knelt down and hugged him tightly. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Thank you. Over Jack's shoulder, Charlotte could see Alexander and Vanessa walking through the market toward the exit, Vanessa's arm looped possessively through his. Just before they passed out of sight, Alexander glanced back, his gaze finding Charlotte's across the crowded space. Something passed between them in that brief moment, not understanding exactly, but perhaps a mutual recognition of the battle lines being drawn. Then he was gone, and Charlotte was left with her children, her herbs, and the mounting dread of what the coming week would bring. The wind had shifted. It carried now the mingled scents of cinnamon, damp soil, and crushed rosemary, the fragrances of a market breathing through its people and goods. Alexander Montgomery IV, heir to tradition and executor of cold numbers, turned away from Charlotte's modest stall, a trace of Charlotte's defiant voice still echoing in his mind. He had dismissed her. Or at least he had tried to. Her words had been too sharp, too raw to ignore. Rules without compassion become tools of oppression. Who said things like that to a duke? He walked slowly, his coat billowing faintly behind him, as if even the wind was unsure whether to push him forward or pull him back. "Wait, mister," came a voice, small, bright, and unafraid. He stopped. Turning around, he saw Emma, Charlotte's daughter, trotting toward him, her boots too big, one scarf end dragging behind her like a flag of childhood rebellion. Her cheeks were pink from the wind, and her hair had started to escape from her braid. In her mittened hand, she clutched something small and green. When she reached him, she stood on tiptoe and held out a tiny, uneven bouquet wrapped in twine. Dandelions, chamomile, clover, and a stubborn little daisy that looked like it had bloomed just for this moment. "These help when someone feels sad," she said, matter-of-factly. Alexander stared at her, the bouquet, then back at her. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. "I picked them," she continued, interpreting his silence as confusion. "We find them by the river, and Mommy taught us which ones are good for headaches and which ones help when someone feels tight here." She pressed her small fist over her chest. He looked at her hand, then at the flowers. Something caught in his throat, not a word, not a cough, just something. You think I'm sad?" he asked. Emma tilted her head, studying him like a young doctor diagnosing a stubborn patient. "A little. You looked sad when Mommy talked about Daddy." He cleared his throat, suddenly finding his voice. "Thank you," he said, taking the bouquet with care. His fingers brushed against her mitten, and he marveled at how uncalloused it felt, soft but strong in the way only a child's could be. Emma smiled, her mission complete, and skipped back toward the stall, scarf fluttering behind her like a ribbon of joy. He stood frozen, staring at the bouquet in his hand. It was uneven, imperfect, a few petals already bruised, but it was beautiful. More beautiful than the flawless centerpieces that adorned his estate dining tables, soulless arrangements imported from greenhouses and flown in on private jets. A sound drew his attention, metal clicking on wood. Jack was crouched by the stall, carefully aligning a small pile of coins. His brow was furrowed with the seriousness of a scholar. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted, lips moving, tongue poking out at the corner in concentration. 7, 8. That's enough for a small bread, maybe, if we skip jam. Charlotte emerged from the other side of the stall, just in time to hear him. "Jack," she said gently, "you don't need to worry about—" "I want to," he interrupted, looking up at her, eyes wide and earnest. "If we give him some money, maybe the Duke man will see we're trying. Maybe we won't have to leave." Alexander took a hesitant step forward, the gravel crunching underfoot. Charlotte turned. Their eyes locked again, and something unspoken passed between them. Shared recognition, quiet desperation, unshielded humanity. Jack saw him and grinned. "Hi again." Alexander gave the faintest nod. "You've been busy." Jack puffed up slightly. "I made $3 selling my lucky stones. They're river polished, and I said they help with happy thoughts. I call them wellness stones." Charlotte's mouth opened in protest, perhaps embarrassment, but Alexander raised a hand. "Entrepreneurial," he said simply. Jack nodded solemnly. "I'm going to help pay the market fee." Alexander looked down at the coins, mostly pennies, a few nickels, one dented quarter, and then at Charlotte. Her face had gone still, like a lake before a storm. Not ashamed, just resigned. A woman used to struggling, used to accepting help only when it came in the form of love, not charity. They're not refusing to pay, he thought. They're trying, against all odds. The bouquet in his hand suddenly felt heavier, as though it now carried not just flowers but weight, of innocence, of hope, of silent pleas never spoken aloud. He bent down to Jack's level, ignoring the cold that nipped through his coat. "You know," he said, "I could use someone smart like you. I always get lost in this market." Jack's eyes lit up. "You do? It's like a maze. If you were my guide next Saturday, think you could help me?" Jack beamed. "I know every stall. I can show you where the real cookies are too." Alexander smiled, a real one this time, small and slow but honest. "That's exactly what I need." He stood again, and Charlotte rose with him. She didn't speak, but her expression had softened, not in surrender but in understanding. A subtle thaw in the wall she kept around her. He held up the wildflowers. "Your daughter has excellent instincts. She gets that from her father," Charlotte said, voice tight. "David used to say the smallest kindness can change the direction of a whole day." Alexander nodded, absorbing that. He sounded like a good man. "He was," she said simply. "A complicated one, but good." A pause stretched between them, neither uncomfortable nor urgent. Then he stepped back. "You and your children clearly belong here, Mrs. Miller." And with that he turned and walked away, his long coat catching the wind as he moved, the wildflowers still in his hand, not crushed, not discarded. He didn't hear Charlotte exhale or see the way her shoulders sagged in a mix of confusion and cautious relief. He didn't see Jack fist pump the air and whisper, "I knew he wasn't all mean." But he did notice that for the first time in many years, the air felt lighter as he walked. That evening, Alexander sat in his private study, the bouquet resting in a small porcelain cup on his desk. Not a vase. He didn't have any of those. Flowers in this house were decorative, not sentimental, arranged by staff, replaced weekly. But this bouquet, this one he had brought in himself. He stared at it for a long time. He had tried all day to forget the weight in Jack's hands as he counted pennies. He had tried to ignore the image of Emma's soft smile, the certainty in her voice when she said, "These help when someone feels sad." He couldn't. He took a deep breath and closed his laptop. The spreadsheet full of market redevelopment projections felt suddenly irrelevant. The numbers told him Charlotte was a liability, but the bouquet told him something else entirely. And for the first time since inheriting the estate, he found himself wondering which of the two was telling the truth. The fire crackled quietly in the grand marble hearth of Montgomery Hall, casting flickering light over the antique paintings and dark oak paneling. Alexander sat alone in the study, a half-empty glass of scotch resting beside the now slightly wilted bouquet of wildflowers. Their colors had faded, but their presence remained stubborn, like the memory of Charlotte's eyes, clear, unwavering, unafraid. He'd returned to the estate hours ago, yet his thoughts had not followed. They were still back at the market, still kneeling beside a child who thought pennies could change the course of fate. He closed his eyes. Behind the darkness, images played. Emma's mitten brushing his hand. Jack's proud grin over $3 and a promise. Charlotte's voice, firm, quiet, echoing. Rules without compassion become tools of oppression. He should be reviewing redevelopment plans. The city council wanted updates on the proposed luxury plaza. Vanessa had sent 3 texts about the boutique hotel renderings she'd chosen, and yet he opened his laptop, not to open the project files, but to search. Charlotte Miller, Westbrook, herb vendor. At first, only mundane listings came up. Market directory, a Facebook page with outdated posts, then an article, a small feature in a local blog. Charlotte Miller, granddaughter of the late Margaret Fenwick, continues the legacy of holistic medicine in Westbrook's farmers market. He clicked. There she was. A photo of Charlotte, standing proudly behind her stall, holding a bouquet of lavender and sage. Emma was beside her, a toddler in that photo. Jack, not yet born. He kept reading. Mentions of her husband, David Miller, decorated Army veteran, injured in service. Passed away 2 years ago after complications from head trauma sustained overseas. Alexander leaned back in his chair, eyes on the ceiling. The pain in his temples not from the scotch but from the realization creeping in. She had never asked for pity. She had never once told him her story in full. She had carried it with grace, with grit, like armor crafted from loss and necessity. He remembered her voice when she said, "I'm not asking for charity." She meant it. He closed the laptop slowly and leaned forward, elbows on knees. His eyes drifted toward the far wall, where a large oil portrait of his father loomed, as it always had. Crisp navy uniform, impeccable posture, eyes that never softened, even in paint. The room seemed to grow colder. 25 years earlier, the same room. A younger Alexander, no more than 10, sat cross-legged on the carpet with a jigsaw puzzle of the world map in front of him. He had almost completed it. He reached for the final piece, Antarctica, when the door opened. "Still here," came the cool voice of his father. Alexander snapped upright. "Yes, sir. I finished my geography reading, so I thought, why aren't you in bed? It's only 8:30. "I didn't ask the time. I asked why you're not in bed." Alexander swallowed hard. I lost track." His father walked over, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. He looked down at the puzzle. "Childish waste of time," he muttered. "Use an atlas. Puzzles are for people who don't retain information." He stepped on the Antarctica piece as he turned and walked away. Alexander hadn't touched a puzzle since present. The memory left a familiar hollow ache in his chest. That was the rhythm of his upbringing: achievement over affection, discipline over empathy. His mother had been elegant, soft-spoken, and mostly absent, always somewhere between a gala and a charity event. His father had measured worth in test scores, posture and obedience. Emotion was weakness, kindness was frivolous. And yet today, a child had handed him wildflowers, and it had meant more than any accolade his family had ever bestowed. The door to the study creaked open. "Alexander!" Vanessa's voice sliced through the silence, clipped and polished like the heels that followed. He didn't turn around. "You didn't come to dinner," she added. "I wasn't hungry." She walked further in, clutching her phone like a scepter. "We have a call with the architect at 10 tomorrow. I told him you'd review the blueprints tonight." "I'll look at them in the morning." She blinked, surprised at the mild resistance. "What's this?" she asked, noticing the bouquet on the desk. She leaned closer, nose wrinkling. "Those aren't from the florist." "They're from a child," he said. "Emma Miller." Vanessa's lip curled, a nearly imperceptible sneer. "The herbal woman's daughter." He finally turned, eyes meeting hers. "Yes. She gave you weeds and you kept them." "They're not weeds," he said, voice even. "They're wildflowers, and she gave them as a kindness." Vanessa laughed once, short and dry. "Darling, you're getting far too sentimental. This market project is business. You can't let sob stories cloud your judgment." Alexander stood. "They're not sob stories, they're lives, people's lives." There was a pause, pregnant, loaded. "Where is this coming from?" she asked, frowning now. "You've always been the pragmatic one." He hesitated. "Maybe that's the problem." Vanessa crossed her arms, her tone hardening. "You're seriously hesitating over a woman who sells root salves in a wooden booth, over a bunch of freeloaders who haven't paid rent in months." "They're not freeloaders," he said sharply now. "They're surviving, barely, and Charlotte Miller is doing it with more dignity than anyone I've ever met." Vanessa's nostrils flared. "This isn't about some poor widow, Alex. It's about Westbrook's future. You promised me we would modernize that place. There's a waiting list of luxury boutiques who would pay triple what those stalls bring in." He looked at her long and hard, and for the first time he felt detached. Detached from her vision, from her goals, from the life they had been meticulously building like a house of glass. "I'm not sure that's the future I want anymore," he said quietly. Silence fell between them, heavier than any argument. Vanessa stared at him like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. "You're changing," she said coldly. "I hope so," he replied. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked out of the room. The silence afterward felt like an exhale he hadn't known he needed. Later that night, Alexander walked the long corridor that led to the East Wing, a part of the estate he rarely entered. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, Montgomery men and women with sharp cheekbones, icy expressions, and eyes painted to look through you rather than at you. He stopped in front of one, his grandfather, the naval officer, regal, decorated, a veteran. He thought of David Miller, Charlotte's husband. Likely no oil portrait to remember him by, no marble plaque. But service? Honor? Yes, maybe more than the entire Montgomery line combined. He imagined David holding Emma's tiny hand, teaching Jack how to skip stones. He imagined the loss Charlotte had suffered. Not abstractly, but intimately. She'd lost more than a husband. She had lost partnership, protection, laughter in the kitchen, another set of arms to carry the weight. And yet she stood, every day, selling herbs and smiling at strangers, raising two luminous children in a broken cottage with a leaking roof. It was more than resilience, it was defiance. He found himself whispering into the still air, "You would have liked her, grandfather." The silence for once didn't feel empty. It felt like agreement. Back in his study, he opened the laptop again, this time to the redevelopment plan. He stared at the sleek renderings, glass storefronts, branded signs, imported stone walkways. It all looked sterile. He minimized the window and opened the article on Charlotte again. Her smile in the photo wasn't polished, it was real, lived in. Revised development vision, integrating legacy with growth, he began to type. The sky hung low over Westbrook as Alexander stepped out of his car 2 blocks from the market. He wore a dark wool coat far less tailored than his usual, the collar turned up against the chill, a knit cap pulled low over his brow. No scarf, no assistance, no trace of the Duke. He blended in. That was the point. There was something thrilling about anonymity, something liberating in not being recognized. It gave him the chance to see, really see, without being seen in return. The market had a rhythm to it he hadn't appreciated before, the soft murmur of bartering voices, the rustle of paper bags, the distant laughter of children chasing one another through rows of pumpkins and apples. It was alive, not just with business but with belonging. He wandered for a while without purpose, pretending to examine jars of jam and artisan cheeses, but his feet guided him as surely as if drawn by string, to her. Charlotte's stall stood as it always did, modest, neat, with bundles of sage and thyme hanging like talismans, but there was something different now in how he looked at it. She wasn't just a vendor, she was a keeper of knowledge, of healing, of old ways that refused to die even in a digital world. And today, she wasn't alone behind the stall. A woman in her 70s stood in front of her, bundled in a patchwork coat. Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse. Charlotte held one hand out gently. "Mrs. Alcott, I told you before, if your knees are still swelling, this salve will help. Don't worry about the cost." The woman shook her head. "I can't keep taking without paying. I don't want to feel like a beggar." "You're not," Charlotte said softly. "You're a friend, and friends take care of each other." She placed a small tin in the woman's palm and closed her fingers around it. "Use it morning and night, and stretch your legs when the sun's out." Alexander stood behind a produce stall across the path, pretending to examine apples, watching the exchange unfold. The elderly woman began to tear up. "You're like your grandmother. She used to do the same thing. Never let anyone leave hurting." Charlotte smiled at that. "She taught me that healing isn't to just what S in the jar. It asks what you give with it." They hugged, and the old woman waddled away with slow, grateful steps. Alexander watched as Charlotte turned back to her stall, reorganizing her tinctures with the grace of someone who had done it 1,000 times, someone whose hands knew more than most doctors. This wasn't performance, this was purpose. He moved away before she could look up. He wandered deeper into the market, half lost in thought, half absorbed by the strange comfort he felt simply being there. It was messy, yes, imperfect, but there was a warmth in its imperfections, a humanity. He passed the bakery stall where Sarah, the cinnamon roll woman he remembered, was chatting with a teenager about school exams. She waved off a payment for a single croissant. "You aced your math quiz. That's worth a pastry." He turned a corner and froze. Jack and Emma were at the far end of the market, crouched behind Mr. Chen's tea stand. They were helping him stack wooden crates, placing the empty ones on a dolly. Alexander took a few steps closer and leaned casually near a barrel of dried beans, pretending to read a handwritten sign. Mr. Chen handed Jack a paper bag. "Leftover lychees and the last of the bok choy, good for stir-fry." "Thanks, Mr. Chen," Jack grinned. Emma held up a bundle of carrots. "And Mrs. Ramirez gave us these because I helped her wash the parsley." "You two work harder than most grown-ups I know," Mr. Chen said warmly. "Now run along. Your mom will want help closing the stall soon." The children scampered off, their bags in hand. Alexander remained where he was, heart heavy and full all at once. This was their dinner. Not groceries, not takeout, not pantry-stapled convenience. Just what the day's labor could earn in goodwill and community. And they never looked ashamed, never pitiful, only proud. It broke something in him. He left the market before Charlotte saw him. There was nothing he could say. Not yet. On the walk back to his car, he passed a mural painted on the side of a bakery wall. Brushstrokes weathered with time. It depicted a mother with children under a tree, holding baskets of vegetables and flowers. The image was simple, almost naive in its style, but it stirred something old and unspoken in his chest. This was the Westbrook he'd nearly erased, Not quaint, not obsolete. Alive. That night, back at the estate, he stood before the mirror in his room and stared at himself. The expensive watch on his wrist, the Italian leather belt, the Oxford shoes aligned in perfect symmetry under his wardrobe. He stripped the layers off slowly, laid the coat aside, removed the tie. He didn't recognize the man staring back. Or perhaps for the first time, he actually did. Alexander walked barefoot down the hall, past the formal dining room, past the silent gallery. He entered the conservatory, where the air always smelled like earth and glass and humidity. His grandfather had built it for his mother, who had once wanted to be a botanist before society demanded she become a socialite. A few forgotten plants still clung to life. Orchids, a small fig tree. He sat on the bench beneath it, hands clasped between his knees, and let the quiet settle around him. His phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. Reminder, gala tomorrow, 7 sharp. Wear the charcoal Tom Ford. My parents will be there. He stared at it, then turned the screen off. Instead, he opened the Notes app and typed a single sentence. Charlotte Miller runs more than a stall, she sustains a system. Then another line. What if value was measured by impact, not income? And another. Maybe we've been defining success wrong all along. He saved the note, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years he didn't dream of profit margins or land acquisitions. He dreamed of wildflowers. The sky over Westbrook had turned a soft shade of pewter, hinting at late autumn. The kind of day where the air tasted of wood smoke and the light fell in long honey-colored bands through the thinning canopy of trees. It should have been an ordinary morning at the market, but nothing about this day would be ordinary. Charlotte was just finishing arranging the elderberry syrups and calendula oil when she noticed a tall man in a tan windbreaker speaking with unusual authority near the flower vendor S stall. He held a clipboard, not the kind vendors used. This one was too official, too stiff. The man turned toward her stall. His steps were deliberate. Charlotte's spine straightened. Charlotte Miller, he asked without preamble, flashing a badge that read Massachusetts Department of Health. Yes, she replied carefully. Can I help you? He flipped a page on the clipboard. We received a complaint regarding your handling of consumable products and the storage of medicinal compounds, Charlotte blinked. I follow all local food safety protocols. Everything I sell is labeled and meets the herbal regulations in the state manual. Then this won't take long, he said briskly, already stepping behind the stall without invitation. I'll need to inspect your work area, ingredient storage, and record of permits. Vendors nearby began to quiet. A ripple moved through the crowd like the hush before a storm. Charlotte felt her pulse pick up. This wasn't normal. She'd never had a visit like this before, not in 7 years. Jack and Emma watched from the side, eyes wide with worry. Charlotte gave them a small smile, hoping it looked more confident than it felt. The inspector opened drawers, examined herbal containers, and took notes more than necessary. He frowned at the hanging bundles of drying herbs. These are exposed to open air. That could be considered a contamination risk. They're non-ingestible, aromatic only, Charlotte clarified. Still, he muttered, scribbling something. Your labels. Some of these don't carry the standard allergen disclaimer. That's because they're topical only. He didn't seem to care. A customer could confuse this for an edible product. That creates liability. She exhaled slowly. Sir, with respect, I've complied with every code the state has published for herbal products. My business is licensed and has passed every inspection. We'll be issuing a temporary suspension, he interrupted. Charlotte's stomach dropped. What? She whispered. Pending a full review. You'll need to cease operations until we complete that process. There was a pause, a moment where reality didn't quite land, where Charlotte's hands hung in the air, still holding the measuring scoop she'd been about to use. Her heart pounded in her ears. Behind her, Emma whispered, "What's happening?" Before she could answer, a new voice entered the scene, firm, calm, unmistakable. "Excuse me," Alexander said. The inspector turned, clearly irritated. "This is official business." "I'm aware," the Duke replied, stepping forward in his crisp navy coat. His hair was still wind-tossed from the walk, and his breath clouded faintly in the cold. Charlotte stared at him in shock. His presence was unexpected, but even more surprising was the way he held himself. not like a curious onlooker, but like someone stepping into battle. "I'm Alexander Montgomery IV," he said clearly, his eyes boring into the inspector's. "And I believe you're exceeding your authority." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Are you representing the vendor?" "No," Alexander said. "I'm representing the property owner, and I've also read the updated 2023 codebook for Massachusetts herbal and small-scale topical sales." He pulled a folded copy of the document from his coat pocket and handed it over. Charlotte blinked. He had printed the regulations. Section 14.3 clearly states that for non-ingestible, non-pharmaceutical topical products sold under limited volume thresholds, allergen labeling is encouraged but not required. The same section specifies drying aromatic herbs for olfactory use is not subject to sealed storage rules. The inspector hesitated. "Still, the complaint came anonymously, I presume?" Alexander asked. The inspector didn't answer. Alexander stepped closer, voice low and dangerous now. "And tell me, what prompted such a sudden interest in a stall that is operated flawlessly for 7 years without a single violation? Why today?" Charlotte felt frozen in place, the crowd thickening now. Vendors leaned in, customers watched. The inspector glanced around, the weight of eyes unsettling him. "We'll revisit this next week," he muttered. "No suspension will be issued today." He turned and left, his clipboard swinging awkwardly as he vanished into the crowd. Silence, then murmurs. A wave of astonished conversation spread like a spark through dry brush. Charlotte stared at Alexander. "You knew," she began. "I suspected," he said. "Last night I received a forwarded email from someone on my board. Vanessa had apparently reached out to a friend in the inspection office. She said the market needed to be brought into line." Charlotte's lips parted in disbelief. "So she sent someone after me?" He nodded. "Yes, and that's not happening, not on my watch." For a moment, the entire world seemed suspended between them. The anger, the fear, the deep gratitude. Her fingers trembled, but she refused to let them show it. "I didn't ask for a savior," she said finally, gently. He nodded. "And I didn't come to be one." She held his gaze. There was something raw there, honest, no longer the cold-eyed aristocrat from their first meeting. Then Jack ran up, holding a wooden spoon like a sword. "Did you scare him away?" Alexander almost smiled. "Let's just say, I read the rules better." Laughter rose nearby. Someone clapped, then someone else. It started as scattered applause, then spread. A vendor yelled, "About time, Montgomery!" Another added, "You finally got some dirt on those shoes." Charlotte looked around in awe as Alexander stood in the center of it all. Still crisp, still formal, but no longer untouchable. She leaned in and said softly, "They're starting to see you differently." He didn't take his eyes off her. "So am I." That night, gossip blazed through Westbrook like a runaway fire. The Duke defended a stall vendor. Can you believe it? He quoted regulations like a lawyer. "Charlotte Miller, she's the one with the kids, right? I saw him touch one of her jars." He smiled. "Vanessa Wellington's going to explode." Back at Montgomery Hall, Vanessa did explode. "You made a scene in a market," she shouted, pacing the drawing room like a lioness in a cage. "You embarrassed me." "I upheld the law," Alexander said coolly, his coat still draped over his arm. "You humiliated yourself. You looked like a commoner, in front of people who don't matter." He looked at her then, and for the first time, his voice held no effort to disguise what he felt. "They do matter, more than you realize," she scoffed. "This woman has bewitched you. You're forgetting who you are." "No," he said, "I'm finally remembering." The frost came early that year, glazing the edges of the Westbrook fields with silver by dawn. But at the market, warmth gathered from more than the low sun. It came in waves of laughter, the clatter of produce crates, and the rising scent of cinnamon, wet earth, and rosemary. Alexander stood under Charlotte's market tent, sleeves rolled, fingers sunk deep into a crate of moist compost, the skin beneath his nails dark with dirt. "You missed a spot," Jack said, pointing to the corner of the wooden planter. Alexander arched an eyebrow, then obediently turned back and began gently spreading the soil again. "You're quite the supervisor," "I take soil structure very seriously," Jack said, pushing up the sleeves of his jacket with an exaggerated air of authority. Emma giggled from beside Charlotte, where she was bundling mint and lemon balm into neat piles. "He just likes bossing adults around." Charlotte didn't laugh, but the smile that tugged at her mouth was warmer than the late autumn sun. "He gets it from his father." Alexander glanced up at her. She had a bandana tied around her head today, streaked with smudges of green and gold pollen from the calendula harvest. She looked grounded, honest, and beautiful in a way no tailored gown or staged lighting could ever mimic. He hadn't worn cufflinks in 2 weeks, hadn't returned Vanessa's last 5 messages, hadn't even opened the architectural plans that once occupied his evenings. Instead, he came here. Every morning for the last 10 days, Alexander had shown up early, first out of curiosity, then out of something he didn't yet know how to name. At first, he'd stood off to the side, offering help awkwardly. But Charlotte, practical as ever, had simply handed him a watering can and said, "Start with the sage and don't drown it." Now he knew the difference between compost tea and fish emulsion, between pruning and pinching, between soil that looked rich and soil that felt alive. And more than that, he had come to know the rhythm of this world, the subtle language of gestures, the unspoken trust between stall owners, the way produce got passed down the line for a neighbor in need, the silent solidarity of shared struggle. Alexander no longer walked through the market as an outsider. He belonged, or at least he was starting to. That morning, while lifting crates of fresh kale into Charlotte's truck, a vendor passed him a thermos of chai and clapped him on the back. "You're stronger than you look, Monty." "Thank you," Alexander replied, suppressing a laugh at the nickname that had emerged and stuck. He caught sight of Charlotte nearby, speaking gently with a new customer about tinctures for joint pain. The customer, an older man with calloused hands and a limp, left with a free sample and a grateful smile. Alexander's heart lifted at the sight. This was real. Not a charity act, not pity. Just 2 people sharing what they could. He was wiping his hands on a cloth when he heard the unmistakable sound of high heels striking cobblestone, then her voice, sharp, clear, and laced with poison. "Well, this is rich." He turned. Vanessa Wellington stood at the edge of the stall, arms folded, lips pursed like a coiled whip. Her coat was camel-colored cashmere, her boots sleek Italian leather, unsuited for gravel. Her presence alone seemed to lower the temperature by 10 degrees. Alexander stepped forward, instinctively shielding Charlotte and the children with his body. "Vanessa, you're playing farmer now," she asked, voice dripping disdain. "This is what you do instead of attending the gala dinner with the planning board, instead of answering my calls." "I've been occupied." She laughed bitterly. "Oh, I can see that. Shoveling dirt, following children, fawning over her." Her eyes landed on Charlotte like venom, then narrowed. "Is this why you've abandoned every promise we made? Because some herb witch fluttered her eyelashes?" Charlotte stiffened. Alexander felt the tension spike. "Watch your words," he said quietly. Vanessa arched an eyebrow. "I'm sorry. Did I offend someone?" "You did," he said. "And not just her." Vanessa stared at him for a beat, then stepped closer. "We are weeks away from finalizing a land deal that will define the Montgomery legacy for a generation. And you're here, digging in mud like some..." She glanced down at his shoes, caked in soil. "Gardener." "I am a gardener," Alexander said, his voice steady. "At least here. And maybe for the first time I'm doing something that matters." "Luxury shops matter," Vanessa hissed. "Development, prestige, expansion, that's your world." He looked around, at the people watching silently, some pretending to stack crates, others still. At Charlotte, calm and composed but tight-lipped. At Jack and Emma, standing behind the counter, arms around each other. Then back at Vanessa. "No," he said. "That was the world I inherited. This," he gestured to the soil, the stalls, the community, "this is the world I've chosen." Vanessa took a step back. "So that's it?" she said. "You'd throw away everything for this?" Alexander didn't answer right away. He simply pulled off the gloves in his hands and set them gently on the wooden crate beside him. "I'm not throwing anything away," he said softly. "I'm finally building something." And with that, he turned and walked back to Charlotte, not with drama, not with fanfare, just certainty. Vanessa stared at his back for a moment longer, then spun on her heel and vanished through the market, a storm in designer heels. Later that day, Charlotte found Alexander sitting on a bench beside the compost bins, elbows on knees, staring at a clump of earth in his hands like it held the answers to everything. "You didn't have to do that," she said gently, sitting beside him. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." She studied him for a moment. "That was the clean break, wasn't it?" He nodded. "I think it's been coming for years. I just didn't much want to admit I was holding on to a version of myself that wasn't ever really me." Charlotte looked at his dirt-streaked knuckles, his bruised pride, his quiet eyes, and then, for the first time, she reached out and took his hand. They sat in silence as the wind moved softly through the drying sunflowers behind them, and for the first time, neither of them needed to speak. The storm came suddenly, like most of the cruel ones do. Dark clouds had gathered over Westbrook all afternoon, heavy and swollen with an unspoken threat. By nightfall, the sky broke open. Howling winds, sideways rain, and a chorus of distant thunder that shook window panes and rattled ancient trees. Charlotte woke sometime after midnight to the groaning of wood. The wind had intensified, sending small branches clattering against the windows of her cottage. She held her breath, listening for the sound that frightened her most. The market. It sat in the lowest part of the town's basin, partially shielded by trees, but vulnerable at the roofline. The old structure, never truly updated in all its decades, had survived snow, hail, even a summer tornado once. But this storm, it felt different. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The silence that followed was worse. She dressed quickly, bundled Jack and Emma into the truck, and drove toward the market, heart hammering with every bend in the road. What she saw made her gasp. The market roof, what was left of it, had partially collapsed. One of the central support beams had snapped in the night, bringing down a large section of the east wing canopy where the bakery and herb stalls stood. Wooden frames were splintered, tents shredded. Rainwater pooled on the concrete like oil slicks. It looked like war. Vendors had already begun arriving, silent and stunned. Sarah stood beside what remained of her cinnamon roll station, hand covering her mouth. Mr. Chen held a broken tea crate in one arm and stared at the wreckage like it might speak to him. Charlotte stepped out of the truck and felt the weight of everyone's eyes. She was no longer just another vendor. She had become a voice. Alexander arrived 30 minutes later, having been woken by a call from one of the market managers. He had dressed fast, barely lacing his boots before getting into his car. As he turned the corner and the devastation came into view, his breath caught. He wasn't prepared. This market, this imperfect, wonderful beating heart of a place, looked broken, wounded. Charlotte stood in the center, sleeves pushed up, already coordinating a group of vendors to move debris and salvage what they could. Her voice was calm but authoritative. "No, don't lift that beam yet. It needs bracing. Stack anything dry under the awning. We can use it to build temporary shelter. Sarah, you have propane tanks at home, right? We'll need them for heat." She moved like a conductor, each instruction purposeful. People listened. She wasn't asking for leadership, she was leadership. Alexander walked toward her, boots splashing through standing water. "Charlotte." She turned, hair soaked from drizzle, hands mud-streaked, eyes determined. "You're here," she said. "I came as soon as I heard. This is..." He looked around. "It's worse than I expected." "We'll manage," she said, with the quiet ferocity he had come to recognize. "We always do." He looked at her, truly looked. This woman who had once seemed to him just another unpaid number on a spreadsheet. Now she was a general without a title, rallying people with nothing but conviction. He swallowed. "Let me help." The following hours blurred into movement. Alexander helped remove cracked beams, carried dry goods into safe storage, coordinated with a roofer he knew in town. Vendors, despite their shock, began to organize, stacking bricks, salvaging inventory, patching what they could with tarps and ingenuity. Still, fear hung heavy. "What if they shut us down for good?" Sarah whispered. "We can't survive weeks without selling." Mr. Ramirez added, "Even if we rebuild, how do we afford permits, materials?" Whispers spread like cold fingers. "It's over. The Duke won't keep it running now. They'll finally tear it down for that luxury plaza." Charlotte heard them all. That night, after putting Emma and Jack to bed on makeshift mattresses in the living room, electricity still flickering from the storm, Charlotte stood by the window, staring out at the wind-battered trees. She felt the pressure building behind her ribs, the desire to cry, to give in. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. The market was more than her livelihood. It was her family's legacy, her children's safety net, her community's table. It had to survive. Alexander didn't sleep. Instead, he found himself deep in the east wing of Montgomery Hall's library, flashlight in hand, searching the old estate records, legal deeds, property charters, founding documents from a time when the town was still considered a frontier village. He flipped through yellowing pages for hours, chasing a feeling he couldn't quite name. Until at last, he found it. Tucked in the back of a bound land agreement dated 1896 was a handwritten clause. "The central grounds known henceforth as Westbrook Market shall remain by order of the Montgomery Family Trust, accessible and available to local growers, traders, and craftsmen of the region. Said grounds are to be protected as public utility space, conditional to its continued use by the community, and provided the integrity of goods be maintained." He read it twice, then 3 more times. A slow, stunned breath left his chest. The market wasn't just a sentimental tradition. It was protected by law, by legacy, by his own bloodline. If he enforced this clause, the land could never be sold to developers. Not legally, it could remain forever. The next morning, he arrived at the market before dawn. Charlotte was already there with a thermos of coffee and a clipboard. The repair effort had grown. Neighbors, even non-vendors, had started pitching in. He walked up, face unreadable. "I found something," he said. She looked up, wiping sweat from her brow. "What is it?" He held up a weathered document, protected now in a clear sleeve. "This clause was written by my great-great-grandfather," he said. "It mandates that this land remain in service to the people of Westbrook, specifically to its local vendors." Charlotte took it in slowly. "You're saying it's protected?" He nodded. "I'm saying the market has always had a right to be here. No one can take it, not even me." A long silence passed between them. She blinked, stunned. "Why didn't you ever know about this?" "I never looked," he admitted, "until I had a reason to." Charlotte reached out and gently touched the sleeve. "Thank you." He looked at her then, eyes soft. "Don't thank me. Just help me honor it." 3 days later, under a sky returning to blue, Alexander called a public meeting on the market steps. Vendors, townspeople, and city officials gathered in folding chairs and stood along the sidewalks. Alexander stood in front of them, papers in hand. He cleared his throat. "My name is Alexander Montgomery IV," he began, "and today I'm not here as a duke. I'm here as a Westbrook citizen." He held up the document. "This market is protected by a clause written more than a century ago, a clause I intend to honor, not just in spirit, but in law." Gasps rippled through the crowd. He continued, "Effective immediately, I am suspending all redevelopment efforts involving this land. A new charter will be drafted to ensure this market remains open, accessible, and guided by the needs of this community. Vendor fees will be reassessed on a sliding scale. A council will be formed, and I'd like Charlotte Miller to lead it." Charlotte's head snapped up from the front row. Murmurs turned into cheers. Applause rang out like a wave. Jack leapt to his feet and shouted, "Go, Mom!" Alexander smiled. He looked at Charlotte again, and this time she smiled back. The letter was short. No drawn-out explanations, no blame, no apologies. Just a single typed page that Alexander placed carefully on Vanessa Wellington's marble-topped vanity table the morning after his public address. "Vanessa, we once wanted the same future, But that was before I learned to see the world not as a balance sheet, but as a living thing, with roots and breath and people who make it matter. We've grown apart, or maybe I've simply grown into myself. I won't be attending the engagement gala. I wish you well in your life. Truly. But mine now belongs elsewhere. Alexander. He didn't expect a reply, and none came. In the weeks that followed the storm and the clause revelation, something remarkable bloomed across Westbrook. Hope, laced with the scent of pine, compost, and cinnamon. Alexander met with city officials, rewrote the market charter from the ground up, and brought on local leaders to co-author it. The new structure wasn't just legal, it was personal, a living document with space for growth. Vendor fees would be scaled according to earnings. Permits would be simplified for family operations. Mentorship programs would be introduced to help young or struggling vendors build sustainable models. Community input would be formalized in a newly founded market council. At the first official meeting, held in the town hall under a banner reading "Our Roots, Our Future," Charlotte Miller was voted unanimously as council chair. Alexander stood in the back row that day, watching her lead with calm authority, listening as she navigated concerns and ideas with clarity and conviction. She didn't ask for attention, she commanded it, the way only someone truly grounded in purpose can. On the morning of the spring equinox, the community gathered for what had once been a ceremonial planting, an old tradition long forgotten. This time, it wasn't symbolic, it was foundational. The new community garden would grow behind the central market stalls, on a patch of land once overgrown with weeds and rusted fences. Children painted handmade signs, vendors donated seeds, locals brought compost and tools. Charlotte arrived first, with Emma and Jack bounding beside her, clutching seed packets and a trowel. Alexander was already there, sleeves rolled, driving stakes into the ground to outline the garden beds. Their eyes met. No formality, no lingering barriers. Just that shared look that had become its own language. "You're early," she said, smiling. "I wanted to get the potatoes in before they start bossing me again," he said, nodding toward Jack. Jack smirked. "I accept no excuses, Duke man." They worked side by side for hours, planting rows of tomatoes, laying mulch between beds, placing hand-painted markers with names like Emma's Beans, Grandma's Sage, and Market Blend Lettuce. The community gathered around, passing tools, kneeling on tarps, trading stories and sandwiches. The mood was one of sweat, joy, and quiet triumph. At one point, Charlotte paused near a raised bed, wiping dirt from her hands. Alexander stood beside her, breathless from hauling compost. She looked at him, eyes full of something unspoken. "You really did it," she said softly. "You changed everything." He shook his head. "We did." She nodded, looking out across the garden, now humming with laughter and life. "Do you regret it? Walking away from everything else?" He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "What I walked away from never actually belonged to me. This does." Charlotte looked down at the soil, at Emma patting the dirt above her seeds, at Jack explaining photosynthesis to a bewildered toddler, and back to Alexander. "And what about us?" she asked, the question hovering just above her breath. He turned to her fully. The wind played with the ends of her hair. The scent of rosemary and sun-warmed grass hung between them. "I don't know where this goes," he admitted, "but I know where I want to be while we figure it out." She stepped closer. "And where is that?" "Here," he said. "Beside you, not in front, not above, just here." A long silence. Then Charlotte smiled, not the polite smile she gave customers, or the practiced one of resilience, but the real one. The one that started in her eyes and unfolded like morning light. She reached down and pressed a seed into the ground. "Then let's see what grows," she said. That evening, long after the last wheelbarrow had been stored and the last child coaxed home for dinner, Alexander and Charlotte stood alone in the garden. The stars blinked to life above them. A single string of market lights buzzed quietly, casting golden halos over the fresh-turned soil. They didn't speak. There was no need. She stood close enough for her shoulder to brush his. And he, once the man of marble corridors and silent dinners, reached down, Not for her hand, not yet, but for another seed. He placed it gently in the earth beside hers. 2 seeds, planted in the same soil, under the same stars. Let time and care do the rest. 1 year later, the Westbrook Farmers Market was now a model for the state. The community garden produced more than just vegetables. It hosted weekly classes, children's workshops, and monthly donation harvests for the town's food bank. The Market Council, led by Charlotte, had helped 2 vendors open brick-and-mortar shops, and 3 others had launched online stores with mentorship from the market's tech initiative. And Alexander? He had traded tailored suits for rolled-up sleeves and council meetings. He still sat on boards, still managed family affairs, but now he answered to more than shareholders. He answered to neighbors, to friends, to a woman with dirt under her nails and fire in her voice, to children who taught him how to kneel. And sometimes, just sometimes, he caught himself smiling for no reason at all. Because somewhere along the way, what began as eviction had become redemption. And what he once called charity, he now called home. Were you touched by this message? Like it now, subscribe to the channel and share it. Someone needs it today, and that click could change everything.